This interview is being conducted for the Muncie LGBTQ plus community history project. My name is Draven Rassler. I use he, him, his. We are recording at 10:30 a.m. on March 16th, 2020 at the Oral History Laboratory in Ball State University's campus. Representing Representative Errington, thank you for your time and willingness to proceed on this project with everything that's happening with the coronavirus. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Sue Errington. I use she, her, hers. I live here in Muncie, and I'm state representative for District 34, which is totally within the city limits of Muncie.
Very good, very good. Okay, as you know, we are interested in the history of the LGBTQ plus community in Muncie. How do you personally identify within the community, or if you do at all?
I'm female, straight.
Yeah. All right. When did you, or how did you become aware of the LGBTQ issues that are seen today?
It was really after I came to Muncie, which was 1970. A couple years after I arrived, Betty Friedan spoke at Emmons Auditorium, and I went, and I just happened to sit down next to a row of NOW members. And we got to talking, and they invited me to come to a reception for her afterwards. It was at the home of Alice Bennett, who was a Ball State biology professor. So there was a whole big room full of us sitting and talking and listening to Betty Friedan. So that led to me signing up probably that night to become a NOW member, because there was a NOW chapter here in Muncie. I'd say most of the members were affiliated with Ball State, either as faculty, staff, or maybe some students. I was part-time faculty here in the language department, and my husband was in the physics department, so that's how I happened to be here. I don't know, I think I'd been a NOW member for maybe a year or two when I went to a regional conference over in Illinois. It might have been Champaign, I don't remember the city exactly, but there were other Muncie NOW members who went too, and that was the first time I had seen women, you know, holding hands, walking arm in arm in what was obviously a romantic relationship.
Yeah.
And the woman I was with that evening was a Ball State faculty member, and she asked me if I had, you know, how I felt about that. And I said, well, you know, this is the first time I've ever seen it, but it's okay. And, you know, we talked a little bit more, and she asked me, do you think there are any lesbians in Muncie? And I said, well, I don't think so. And so we talked a little bit more, but later I just realized that she was a lesbian. And so I think she was, you know, wanting to know how did I feel, and was it safe to come out to me? And I think she decided to hold off when we were there. She just didn't feel quite safe.
Not yet for that. Did the LGBTQ plus issues, like, were they ever talked about within the NOW community? Like,
yes, but it was more like, you know, this is something that happened somewhere else.
Okay, yeah, so they kind of talked like, you know, this is not from here, but it's over there.
Yeah, we know this is going, we know this, but we don't know anybody who is lesbian.
Were there, was that like the only conversations that were talked about within it, or were there?
Oh no, there were all kinds of conversations about women's rights, and the Equal Rights Amendment at that time was an active issue in Indiana, and we did pass
Yeah.
the Equal Rights Amendment before the deadline. But reproductive rights, abortion rights, this was really at the time when Roe v. Wade was decided. Equal credit for women. When I got married, it was in 1966, I had credit cards, but my husband didn't. And when we got married, the credit card companies sent new cards that were in his name, not mine. And I remember when we moved to Muncie, I wanted a credit card for what was in Ball stores. It was the big department store, locally owned. And when I went to sign up, they wanted Paul's name. I said, I want this card in my name. He's not going to be shopping here, it's me. So it took a little while, but I did get my card in my name.
Referring to now, the National Organization of Women, what other topics were talked about involving the LGBTQ community?
Well, there was a national debate. This was before I became active at the national level. But there was sort of a difference of opinion. There were quite a number of lesbians who were members of NOW and very active. If anybody was active in NOW as far as doing the work, they were wholeheartedly in, because they not only had the sexist, but they had gendered, or their gender identification issues, discrimination as well. So they had more than maybe I had invested in making change. But anyway, there was a debate as to whether lesbians were a asset or a detraction from the movement. Would people who were opposed to gay rights and wanted everybody to be in the closet, would they make it harder for women to make progress, or did it not matter? And so there was a conference where there was as I say, there was a big debate, there was a vote, and and it wasn't just the lesbians who were saying, we're an asset. It was straight women as well. And that's the group that won out. So from that time on, lesbian rights were a really accepted part of the National Organization for Women's agenda.
Where did you stand with being an advocate or not being an advocate, or seeing them as an advocate for the...
Well, at the time that debate went on, I wasn't even aware it was going on. So by the time I started becoming active at more than the local level, I was like, yes. And actually, locally, we would hear things, and we'd talk about it, and I think everybody was accepting. I never heard anybody say, well, no, we should not allow them to be NOW members here in Muncie. I think it's just that we didn't know there were. I mean, there already were, and we didn't know it. Those of us who were straight.
You mentioned you going nationally with the organization. Can you tell me any positions you might have held, or what was your role within NOW?
Sure. Well, I first went to the state level. I became the state president of NOW, and that was at the time we passed the Equal Rights Amendment. And from there, I ran for the national board of NOW and was elected. So I was on the national board of NOW. This would have been in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
Okay.
I also participated in some of the national projects we had, basically around the Equal Rights Amendment. I went to Utah as an ERA missionary, we sort of mimicked what the Mormons do when they send people out 2 by 2 to knock on people's door and tell them about the Mormon religion. Well, we went 2 by 2, door to door in Salt Lake City and a few other cities in Utah with petitions in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. So our job was to talk with people about what it was, because the Mormon Church had an official position in opposition. So we wanted to get under that official position to see what the regular Mormons and others who lived in Utah felt. So we got a lot of petition signatures. At that time, a majority of people living in Salt Lake City were not Mormon. And a lot of them felt discriminated against because of their religion, that they weren't Mormons. So they jumped at signing those petitions. And we did get some Mormon signatures as well. So that was one project. I went to Oklahoma. That was one of the states that we were hoping to ratify before the deadline passed. And we came close, but we didn't quite make it. I went to some national marches in Washington, D.C. In fact, one of them was an LGBTQ plus. Didn't have plus back then. I'm not sure we had T. It was in that label. But anyway, I went to that, and they had the AIDS quilt displayed on the mall. That was just, it just took your breath away to see it.
The AIDS quilt, what, can you explain that to me? I've never heard about that.
Okay, well, it's probably in the Smithsonian or some other museum now. But this was at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And so many people were dying. And there became a movement to make a quilt square. They were made by people who knew the person who died of AIDS. And so they would decorate their square with things that made them think of the person who had died. And then these were put together, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger, and a piece of it was brought to Ball State. It filled the gymnasium floor over. We didn't have Worthen Arena then, so it would have been the gymnasium by the swimming pool.
I wonder if that was Ball Gym. I'm not sure.
I think Ball Gym isn't that behind Cooper Science?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't that. It was over off of over by McKinley.
But it filled a whole entire gym floor?
It filled the floor.
So this is a very large quilt then.
And that was just a piece of it. As I say, the full quilt I got to see, and it was still ongoing. What I saw probably wasn't as much as it ended up being, but it took a lot of the mall.
So you're very active, I can tell, with being in many have you been in other organizations other than now? I think from what I've seen,
yes.
I believe so.
Yes, I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and AAUW here locally. We have a group called the Coalition of Women's Organizations that how we got started was there weren't very many women appointed to boards and commissions in Muncie and Delaware County. And so we did a project of finding out what the boards were, who all was on them, who made the appointments and when, and then we had the next part of the project was finding women who would like to put their names forward to be on some of these boards. So it was sort of our initial project was to get more representation by women on local boards and commissions. But then the other thing we decided we wanted to do was to recognize women who have made a difference in Delaware County. So on August 26th is Women's Equality Day. That's the anniversary of when women got the vote. So we decided on August 26th we would recognize a group of women who had made a difference. So we we did a newspaper article asking for people to submit names. And that first year, I think there were so many, we decided we'd do 20. Well, it turned out that took a long time to have recognize a woman, let her say something, and then we thought, well, this went on too long. We better shorten it. So now we're still doing it. This is I think it's more. We've been doing it for over 20 years on on or around August 26th. Now we do 6 women at a time. We get more, recommendations than that each year, but we decided that it's more manageable just to do 6.
Participating in all these organizations, is that what encouraged you to go into politics and
Yes.
like being a senator and
Yes.
representative? Can you explain to me
Okay.
That process?
Well, as a NOW member, we first really just focused on issues. But then we realized that sometimes it's easier to change legislators than to change a legislator's mind. And so that's when we started getting involved in political campaigns. And that we did that with the Equal Rights Amendment here in Indiana. We looked at where the votes were on the Equal Rights Amendment in the House and the Senate. And we realized that the leadership in the House of both the Democrats and Republicans was pro-ERA. So, and it seemed to be pretty well mixed as far as pro and con. So we thought it really didn't matter whether the House was majority Democrats or Republicans because the leadership was with us. It was over in the Senate that it made a difference. And so we looked at races that we thought we could have an impact in by going and working, volunteering for the candidate. And we did go to, I think, some House races, but mostly we targeted the Senate because we knew in order to get the Equal Rights Amendment through, the leadership, the majority had to be Democratic. So that's what we did. We looked at different races. One of them was up in Marion. And that's where those of us from Muncie would go. A carload of us would go at least once a week up to Marion to go door to door for our candidate. And they even invited us to be on his candidate committee. But we decided it was a little too far. At that time, we didn't have as many 4-lane highways up to Marion as we do now. It only took an hour, but still we decided we'd only just go once a week and really do the work that they needed, which was going door to door. Well, our candidate lost,
Who was
but
the candidate?
enough of them won that it did switch the leadership. The majority of the Indiana Senate was Democratic. Long enough to get the ERA passed. But the next election, the Senate went back to Republican majority, and it's been that way ever since.
Who was the candidate that you were supporting?
I'm trying to remember his name. Maybe I'll think of it later.
That's all right. That's all right. Would you consider yourself an advocate for the LGBTQ plus community?
Yes.
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 How is
In
that?
fact, currently I serve on the board of Muncie Outreach, which is an organization that provides support, education to LGBTQ youth. That was the original mission. It's grown over it started in 2012 by a woman whose son was gay, or is gay, and at the time he was in high school and being bullied, and the school didn't want to do anything, didn't think there was any need. And so she, in 2012, started this organization to be a place where young people could go and feel safe, talk about things that were on their minds. And as I say, then it was probably maybe 3 years later that she asked me if I wanted to be on the board, and I said yes.
Okay, so you came around to being around 2015 then?
I think that's when I became active.
Active, okay. So
as
you
a
were
board
involved.
member.
Okay. Were you active before that?
Not with that organization. Its first home was in the Unitarian Universalist Church of Muncie, which is where I go to church. I'm a member. And so I knew about it because they were meeting. They have meetings. Friday night it'd be a meal, and then either an educational session or fun. They do proms. They've gone to Indy Pride several times. But now it's, as I say, it's getting bigger and sort of branching out. There's now a transgender part of the organization. There's also Muncie Pride is getting started, which is actually separate, but they don't have their 501c3 status yet. So we're sort of like the parent organization till they are on their own.
What was the name of the founder of the outreach?
Laura Janney.
Laura Janney.
Now, before Laura, there was I don't know if it was a formal organization or if it was just individuals, but I think they also met at the church. They were affiliated with PFLAG, which is Parents and Allies. And so I know a woman who is involved with that, or was, and I think it was because she had a child who was gay. But that organization folded after a few years, at least in Muncie. I know it's still a national organization.
Wow. Do you know the time of when it might have stopped?
That would have been probably 2000 or sometime around then. Judy Egbert was I think the leader of the group here in Muncie. She actually was from Anderson, but she taught at Ball State. She's in the social work department.
Could you tell me a couple of stories or some of your experiences and kind of explain what you do as a board member for outreach?
I have a background in fundraising.
Yes, you do. I've noticed.
And so I thought that's where I can be most helpful. So I became chair of the fundraising committee. Right now I'm a member. I'm at least temporarily not the chair because I'm out of town so much at the legislature. But we have a really good person who stepped up to the plate, Mark Lytle. And so he's chairing it now. So we do mailings, we do events, and in fact, that's how I stumbled onto this project because the Mark was having a drag show, and the first one I'd ever gone to. Had a drag show and a silent auction, and the proceeds were going to outreach. So I wanted to go, and that's where I found out about this project.
How has it been being an advocate for the LGBTQ plus rights in the House of Representatives?
Well, I'm a Democrat, and I would say my entire caucus is supportive. On the Republican side, I think it's mixed. But I mean, when you're in the legislature, some of the legislators, even Democrats, are in districts where LGBTQ rights are not an accepted thing, at least by the majority. So those members have to be, I mean, they want to be reflective of their districts, because if you're not, you probably won't stay very long. So they have to be much more, I guess, cautious. Now, for me, my district, I feel, is majority believes in equal rights for everybody. Certainly there are people who, because of their religious beliefs, think differently. But I would say the majority of people in Muncie are tolerant and accepting. So I feel that, you know, I can be a leader and be much more outspoken and help educate people on why we should accept everybody as they are.
Have you faced any pushback from legislators or community members for being an advocate for the LGBTQ community?
Well, it's been quite a while, but when I went to Washington, D.C. for that march where the AIDS quilt was out, I can't remember if I was running for election. My first election was to the Delaware County Council. That was in the mid-90s.
Okay.
And it was either that happened at the time of the election, or it was a year or two later. I think it was at the time of it, because I happened to mention to somebody at the county building that I was going. The next thing I knew, it was in the political gossip column. You know, I think probably when I got back is when I saw it, and I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder why that was in the news. But it was, and in that particular column.
Did it have any effect to?
Well, I went door to door, you know, with my literature, and I went to this one door where when I told the woman who opened the door what my name was, she got this look like she was seeing Satan and backed away from me and said something about, you know, gays and lesbians, and slammed the door. So, you know, it hasn't been that long ago.
You said that was probably mid-90s?
That would have been in the mid-90s, yeah.
What about from legislators? Have you had any pushback from being an advocate there?
No.
No?
No.
Good.
In fact, in the Senate, there's an openly gay man now. He's the only one that is open, at least. He was elected 2 years ago.
What's his name?
J.D. Ford.
So the majority of people in Muncie haven't always supported LGBTQ plus rights?
I would say it's been an evolution. And I think it was really helped when the marriage amendment was debated, because people started coming out of the closet. I think that helped a lot, because maybe people who weren't supportive didn't realize their nephew or their daughter or their neighbor was gay.
Yeah. When did or how did you see change? Like, when would you say you saw change in the community?
Oh, it happened immediately with the Supreme Court decision. uh, saying it was unconstitutional to limit marriage to just heterosexual marriage. I think that made a huge difference. That and the fight, we had in Indiana an amendment to the proposed amendment to the Indiana Constitution that would limit marriage to one man and one woman. Now, the way constitutional amendments are done in Indiana, it's a very long, difficult process. The amendment has to be voted out in 2 different sessions of the General Assembly with an election in between. So there you've got at least 3 years. So it has to be a majority vote in 2 different legislatures. And if it passes, and it has to be the exact same wording. If there's a comma that's changed, they have to start all over again. But so the next step, if it gets through the General Assembly twice with an election in between, then it goes to the people as a ballot issue. And if the majority votes yes, then it becomes part of the Constitution.
Were you involved for advocating for the same-sex marriage, either in Indiana or federally?
I was advocating against this amendment in Indiana that would limit, that would prohibit same-sex marriage.
Okay.
In fact, I was in the legislature when that was being debated, and of course I voted against it. But the second time, that's when Indiana Equality became organized. And major corporations in Indiana were coming out in support of gay marriage because they could see that the kind of talent they wanted to bring into the state to work at their places of business were young people who were much more open-minded, and some of them were gay, lesbian, and transgender. And so they didn't want to limit their pool of applicants or to have Indiana branded as an unwelcoming state that wasn't open to everybody. So they provided a lot of money for the initiative to change people's minds in Indiana. So they sent out, the Indiana Equality sent out people, excuse me.
There's some water there if you like it.
Sent out organizers. They went door to door. And I remember Kevin Mahan, who's no longer a legislator, but he had part of Delaware County. He was from Hartford City, telling at a Chamber of Commerce legislative update that his neighbor knocked on his door and asked him to vote against the marriage amendment. He was flabbergasted. He'd have no idea. I mean, the neighbor wasn't gay, I don't think, but the neighbor felt that amendment was the wrong thing for Indiana. So that was happening, all over the state, where these Republicans who had been really the major drivers of this marriage amendment, where they were being confronted by people that they lived around saying, we don't want this. You get this idea because there are organized groups that, in this case, they were often organizing through very conservative fundamentalist churches. So their minister would call people and tell them, call your legislator, here's his phone number. So they'd be getting all this, these calls and letters from people who said, yes, we want to make marriage just between a man and a woman. Vote yes on the marriage amendment. So that's the kind of messages they were getting, but it turns out those people, even though they were very active, were not the majority of people in Indiana. So once the Indiana Equality began telling other people, you know, if we don't speak out, we're going to have this in our Constitution. So they did, and in the end, in that second legislative session, the marriage amendment failed.
How did you, or what was your experience with mailing and people giving you phone calls talking about the Marriage Act?
Well, I was pretty openly, opposed to that that amendment. So most of what I heard were people were saying thank you.
Okay, okay, that's good. Have you ever worried that your support for the LGBTQ plus community issues would affect your electability?
Well, when that woman slammed the door on me, I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder how many more are like her. But it didn't. I won. So the other thing in my life has been Planned Parenthood. First I was a volunteer, then I was on the board, and then for 17 years I was on staff at Planned Parenthood. And when I ran for county council, I was still working for Planned Parenthood. So that was, people said, oh, I don't know if you can win when you work for Planned Parenthood. Well, it turned out I won big. Then when I decided to run, I ran for this, I was in the Indiana Senate before I was in the House.
Was that 2006 to 2010?
Yeah, yes. And so when I decided to run for that, I started hearing from, allies who said, oh, do you think you really should because you've got all this Planned Parenthood baggage? And I said, people like Planned Parenthood. So many women Planned Parenthood has been their doctor when they needed it, usually when they were, in college or in their 20s, some in their teens, but the biggest group are, women working at low-income jobs, can't afford, another doctor, so they go to Planned Parenthood. So, and college women. So I knew, and I could see the polls that show that Planned Parenthood is very favorably viewed by the public. So I said, no, I'm running. And I won.
Did LGBTQ plus issues ever come up in your work with Planned Parenthood?
Yes, because Planned Parenthood is a safe place. And they do STD testing and treatment. They do HIV testing. So yes, confidentiality at Planned Parenthood is paramount. People feel that they can come there, and we're not going to be Planned Parenthood. Nobody's going to be saying, "Oh well, so and so came in for an STD test."
I know that you've worked on including gender identity in the state anti-discrimination code. Can you tell me more about that?
Are you talking about the hate crimes, or are you talking about RFRA?
I'm talking about,
Well, there's both.
Yeah.
The first one was RFRA, which was a backlash, a right-wing backlash against the defeat of the marriage amendment. The claim was that people who have their, in business should not have to, bake a wedding cake for a gay couple. That's sort of the classic image. And so they were pitting religious rights against gay rights. And, I opposed that. If you're in business, you're open to the public. And so they made a big deal about it. And it passed. I think it was pretty much on party lines. And then the governor, that was Governor Pence at the time, signed the bill. Well, there was a huge public outcry, backlash against this bill, which was now law. Pence had a big, Governor Pence had a signing ceremony with him and people around him that had been instrumental in getting it through. But and he did it immediately. A lot of times the governor, it doesn't happen. The signing doesn't happen within hours of a bill passing, but this one did. And so the outcry was enormous and immediate. Indianapolis is seen as a amateur sports center, and people were canceling, championship tournaments, and businesses were threatening not to come to conventions in Indianapolis. They were the ones that were here were saying, we don't know if we want to stay. And so it quickly, and then Governor Pence was on one of the TV talk shows on Sunday morning, and so the whole nation saw him trying to avoid the questions. And it just became a horrible black eye for Indiana. We were afraid nobody was going to come to our state. It would devastate conventions and tourism and economic development. So another bill was quickly passed that was toned it down. I didn't vote for that either, but that's what RFRA is now. Now the other bill was hate crimes bill. Indiana did not have a hate crimes bill, even though most other states did. And this is a bill, a law that would, if someone commits a crime and during the trial, you see that the motivation was hate, then the judge has the ability to add extra years on the sentence. So we had two competing versions of the bill. The first one, the original bill, was comprehensive, and it listed the categories that would constitute a hate crime. But again, those who were worried, and it was the gay rights issue that caused the controversy. Those people got out. They started making their calls to their legislators again. And so a second version was amended. The first version was stripped out of the bill. The second was put in that was much more vague. And they did have some classes that you should consider, but discrimination or a crime on the basis of a person's sex, the victim's sex was not part of it. And of course, gender, age, and gender identification were all left out. But it passed, and I voted against that. So I still would like to see that hate crimes bill be strengthened.
You stated in an interview released by the Indiana House Democrats, this program could be solved simply by adding 4 words and a comma to our Civil Rights Code. Could you clarify for later viewers what you meant by this?
Oh, now I'm trying to think. I forget now.
This was, I think you were referring to the sexual orientation and gender identity in the civil rights.
So I guess it would be gender and gender identity, comma. That's something we were trying, at that time we were trying to make people understand how so few words could make such a big difference. and but they didn't go for it. The people who voted for that bill.
What were those things left out? Why were those things left out? Sorry.
Well, I think part of it was that they were in such a rush to get it done. So it might have, I mean, I can't imagine why they left out women. We're over 50% of the population, and there are a lot of crimes that are really hate crimes against women. So then age was left out. Those may have been oversights because they were in a hurry, or maybe they hadn't really looked to see what other states were doing. I think their focus was making sure that gender identity was left out.
Okay.
I think they knew they wanted to leave that out. I think they may have accidentally left the others out, although they could have added them in as an amendment, but didn't. And maybe they didn't, at that point, they didn't want to make it look like, oh, we're just targeting this one group.
Has
which
there
they
been
were.
has there been any edits since then, like to include these, or?
There have been some bills, but if they don't get a hearing, they die.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many bills introduced every year, you don't look at every one of them. If you're not on a committee that would be hearing that, you probably wouldn't even be aware it was there.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about your professional or political experiences?
I guess just that Indiana's attitudes are evolving, so I have hope. They may not be evolving as quickly as I would like, but I do think we're becoming a more open society here in Indiana. I didn't mention the 2-year, I guess you'd call it a project, in my church when we became a welcoming congregation, it's called. It was a project to educate our congregation on gay rights issues and to make people feel comfortable with that. And at the end of the 2 years, we actually voted on whether to become a welcoming congregation, which meant it would be welcoming to everybody. And the vote was, yes, we do want to do that. It wasn't unanimous because there were some in the congregation that were concerned that we would be labeled as the gay church. But they were in the minority, and I think I would guess this has been probably 10 years ago. That is, they've seen that we're not sort of set aside as the gay church. That their fears were not realized. So I think that experience is probably, I would guess, everybody in the congregation, if that vote were held today, would vote yes.
What was the name of your church?
Unitarian Universalist Church of Muncie.
Well,
of course, now the Methodist Church is going through this. And a friend of mine is at College Avenue Methodist Church, and she's very supportive of gay rights. And she was dismayed at the national convention vote, I guess it was last year. And she believes that the church may split over this issue. And she feels that if they do, her church would be on the side of openness. So I don't know about the other church. There are several Methodist churches in Muncie. I don't know anybody who's talked about that issue to me, so I don't know where the other Methodist churches in Muncie would stand, but that might be an interesting thing to add to your project.
Mm-hmm. It would. How has your church changed since the saying yes to this, or what's been the changes, or can you tell me more about that?
I think it would be easier to say if I were a lesbian,
Mm-hmm.
because then I would know my guess is people in the gay community feel that they can express themselves more openly than they did before. I mean, we have quite a number of gays and lesbians in the congregation who are not in the closet at all.
Mm-hmm. Were they a part of the congregation before this, or are they new? Or
I can't they may be newer. We probably have gained some members because of that decision. I don't know if we've lost any or not.
I know the gender pay gap is an important issue for you.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that?
Yes. There's a gap between the average wages that women make as a whole and men make. And in Indiana, we have the 4th largest pay gap in the country. So and there are several things that contribute to it. But there's definitely a discrimination going on, although it may be, not conscious. But some of the things that we're used to can lead to discrimination without people really understanding that that's what's happened. For example, a lot of it happens in the interview process. If the interviewer asks about wage history, and often women have been at a lower paying job than a man applying for the same position. So you tell them what you got in the past. Well, right away in the interviewer's mind is, she hasn't been making as much, she's not expecting as much. And sometimes they'll ask, what are your wage expectations? And this is on the person who's being interviewed. And most people think, well, they'll up it 10, maybe 20%. But if you're at a lower salary, that figure that's going on in your mind may be lower than what it would be if you were making a higher salary. So it just sort of, as you go from job to job, what you start at follows you. And sometimes you never overcome that gap. Another thing is being able to talk with your fellow employees about what they're paid. There are some companies that have a prohibition against this, and others that it's just discouraged. And sometimes a woman doesn't know that the guy next to her is making more than she is for the same amount of time and effort. There was a very famous Supreme Court case that was based on this issue. Lily Ledbetter worked at Goodyear, the tire company,
Mm-hmm.
for years. And it wasn't until a coworker anonymously slipped her a note about what his salary was. And then she saw what hers was. And that's when she complained, went to court, and she actually won.
Have you noticed, or do you know of any pay gaps between straights and LGBT plus community members?
I don't know specifically of any, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some. They've done studies on minorities and have found that African Americans and African Americans make, especially women, make less than Caucasians, and Latinos even less. So there is that, but I haven't seen any studies on gay straight.
You mentioned earlier that T wasn't in the acronym back when you were starting off with your organizations. When did you become aware of trans issues?
It was actually at church. We had a guest speaker who was trans, I think from Indianapolis. And I guess that's the first person that I met that was trans. But now, we also, that was something that we discussed as an issue.
What was that discussion like?
I don't think it was, I don't remember really. Mm-hmm. What I do remember was that there was some resistance among lesbians of adding that to the label, and maybe gays felt the same way, that it would, when you're just emerging from discrimination and you feel like your rights are getting stronger, and then somebody else comes along who has fewer rights than you do, you begin to fear that that might take away from yours. Mm-hmm. So I think there was some resistance at the beginning, and maybe if you ask that question of some of the other people you interview, they may be able, but I just got that sense that there was a concern, mm-hmm. which was overcome, of course, but at the beginning I think there was that concern. Just like among the straight women in now, worried that now would our progress for women's rights in general would be held back if it was associated with lesbians.
Was this the Lavender Menace?
Yes.
It was in the now.
Yes.
Were you? How did you experience the Lavender Menace? Were you a part of the group by then, or was it later that you heard about it?
It was really later.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Was it still talked about at all now, or was it just something that was?
Oh, people sort of laughed about it.
Yeah. Can you?
And actually, when I was in Oklahoma on the ERA campaign, there had been there was a national conference for women that leading up to it, there were state conferences. And when I was in Oklahoma, I think the national conference had already happened. But I was on the phone talking with people about the Equal Rights Amendment and trying to get them, supportive. And I talked to this one woman who said, "No, that's full of lesbians. That's for lesbians. They were in Texas at the National Women's Conference wearing their orange." Well, it wasn't orange, it was purple,
yeah.
Lavender. So she got the idea, but she got the color wrong. So, I just had to laugh to myself, hang up, say goodbye.
Can you say more about the guest speaker that you were referring to about when you were introduced to transgender issues?
Okay, it's been several years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was a woman who had transed into a man, and he talked about his life growing up and his feelings that he wasn't in the right body. Mm-hmm. And I don't, I think he struggled with his family as he was beginning to see where he needed to be. And I don't remember now if there had been a reconciliation between her and her family. Well, he. He was married to a woman, and fairly young, as I recall, maybe early 30s.
What was the reaction in the crowd, I guess?
Well, our church members are very inquisitive people. So, you know, people ask questions. People were very empathetic, I would say, and so it was it was educational for people, and we began to understand better that sexual identity isn't just this end and that end. Mm-hmm. That there's a whole lot in between, and in fact, Planned Parenthood and the UU Church, and there's another church that's involved, has a sex education program that is, we did it in our church, and there's different segments, age appropriate. It goes from, you know, very young, where, you know, it's basically talking about the correct body parts and things like that, up to sex life for seniors. But I was a facilitator. We have a male and female facilitator, and the group that I worked with were high school students. We had about a dozen, and it was all anything that was said there stayed there, so that the students, the teens, could feel comfortable asking questions and talking about their feelings. In that particular group, no one was gay. And I think if they had been, they'd have felt comfortable saying so. But I'm sure that many of these groups do have young people that are, you know, are questioning. And there are a lot of questioning youth that are not sure, you know, what their feelings are. So those kinds of gatherings are helpful. And that's another thing with outreach. There are sometimes young people who come who aren't sure, and that helps them sort out, you know, their feelings.
Was that group and outreach, was that the same?
No. They were, again, maybe 6 or 8 years difference when we had that. But it's called Our Whole Lives, or OWL, mm-hmm. is the sex ed program. And it's continuing in the church.
Is this your church?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
You said correct body parts. Can you kind of clarify what you meant by that?
Well, instead of saying wee-wee, you say penis, okay. Vagina. So that people, the idea, you know, when you use these euphemisms, it makes you think, you know, is there something wrong? Is there something dirty about this? Why? Okay. When you find out later, there's, you know, a scientific or, you know, a medical term. Mm-hmm. But the idea is to make the young kids feel comfortable with their bodies.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me about your educational experiences? I know you went to IU, and I mm-hmm. believe you went to University of Michigan.
Yes.
Can you just tell me a little bit about those?
Okay. Well, let me start a little farther back.
All right.
I grew up in a small town in northern Indiana. Mm-hmm. A few years after I graduated, the school was consolidated into Warsaw.
Oh, I know
But-
where Warsaw's from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm from Atwood.
Okay, yeah.
You know Atwood?
Yeah, I live near there actually.
Where?
So I live in maybe Topeka's close to Atwood. I can't remember.
Oh, I know where. I have a classmate who lives in Topeka.
Yeah.
Well, she did. Now she's moved to Goshen, but she lived in Topeka. Well, there were 16 in my graduating class. Every one of us white. I don't think there were even any Catholics there. If anybody was gay, they were so far in the closet we didn't know it. So that's my background. And so then I went to IU. I wanted to go to the big school. And then University of Michigan. I was at University of Michigan. That's where I got my master's degree. That was when the protests of the Vietnam War were beginning. I think they were beginning probably even while I was at IU, but IU wasn't as activist politically as Michigan was. It was quite a change. And maybe it was a few months later that IU may have become much more against students opposing the Vietnam War. But when I was at Michigan, that's where the first teach-in in the country was held. And it was an educational session, all campus invited. I went. That was organized by Tom Hayden and Jerry Rubin, who were, I think, graduate students. Maybe they were undergraduates there at the time. And they organized this teach-in about why the Vietnam War was wrong. As far as the issue we're talking about here, I do remember at IU there were whispers, both basically. I'm sure there was an active gay community there, but I wasn't involved and really didn't know much about it.
So were there no issues that you heard about while you were at IU about the LGBTQ community?
Not that I remember.
Did you experience any LGBTQ plus issues ever when you were at the University of Michigan? Yeah.
No, I didn't. I was only there a year. It took me, 3 semesters to get through, so I wasn't there very long. And the opposition to the Vietnam War was so much bigger than anything else that's what I remember.
Were you aware of LGBTQ plus issues in your high school or junior high?
Only whispers that so-and-so may be gay. I do remember when I was in college, I have a brother who's 9 years younger. And I think he was probably in junior high. And I wondered whether he and his friends were too friendly. But turns out he's straight. But I guess and I don't know what made me think that.
Did your parents ever say anything to you about gay people?
I don't recall that they ever did.
Can you tell me more about your family of origin? So your parents and your siblings?
Okay. My mother was born and died within 10 miles of where she was born and died. She never left the Atwood community. My dad, on the other hand, was from Lexington, Kentucky, and he studied poultry. And you may have heard of Creighton Brothers. It's a big poultry farm outside of Warsaw.
I can't say that I have. I'd have to drive by to
Okay.
see it, I'm sure.
Well, it's on old US 30.
I might have driven
You
past it
probably
a time
did.
or two then, for sure.
But anyway, he was at UK on a recruiting trip. The owner of the company, I mean, it was just a young company then. But he was on a recruiting trip and talked to one of my dad's professors and said, "You got any people graduating that you would recommend?" And he said, "Yeah, there's John Frederick." So they met, and sight unseen, my dad accepted the job and moved up to Atwood. And my mother was working as a bookkeeper for Creighton Brothers at the time. My dad, Hobart Creighton, hired him, and he gave him a place to stay in his house. So he was living with the boss. And he met my mom, and then they fell in love and got married. I'm the oldest of 4 children. My next sibling is a brother, and then a sister, and another brother. The brother that was next to me in age had OCD and depression, and about 9 years ago he committed suicide. So that was hard. But the rest of us are, doing fine. And the other 2 live in Indiana. My sister lives in Elwood, and my brother lives in DeMott, which is outside of Valparaiso.
When did you move to Muncie?
1970.
1970.
Now, I started out my career as a Spanish teacher. That's what I studied at IU and Michigan. And I spent 2 summers at the Spanish school in Middlebury, Vermont. I also took, students' trip to Mexico. But then after Paul and I were married, we went to Peru, South America for basically a year. He had a Fulbright lectureship, and I studied Spanish and taught English while we were there. We lived in Lima, and then when that grant ran out, we came back to the States. And how we happened to end up at Ball State is the chair of the physics and astronomy department, he was a eclipse man. He'd been in Argentina to view an eclipse and came up to Lima, where he had been before, and visited the Fulbright office and met my husband and said, "Well, when you get done here, if you're looking for a job, we might have a temporary position." So Paul never thought, he was from West Virginia. He loved the mountains, didn't like flat land. But when we went back, it was just when the job market fell out for physicists, because the NASA program for space was ramping down quickly. And so all these scientists that had been with NASA are now looking for jobs, and they go to the universities and colleges. And so there wasn't much available when he got back. So he took up the offer at Ball State, and we thought we'd be here maybe 3 years. He taught there for 34.
How did you meet Paul?
Our first teaching job, it was at Bethany College outside of Wheeling, West Virginia, in this little town called Bethany. Mm-hmm. It was still affiliated with the Disciples of Christ Church, which is what Butler started out. Mm-hmm. And Butler, though, became secular, while Bethany was still affiliated with the church. Wasn't a real religious congregation, but they did have vespers and religious services for the students. But the faculty became pretty close-knit because we were back there in the woods most of the students, ironically, came from places like Philadelphia and New Jersey and New York because they wanted to get away from the city and into a different setting. You know, I was just the opposite. I'd come from this little town. I wanted to get to the big university. So that's who the student body was. And Paul and I, when we got engaged, the president of the college had a party for us. And he said this is the first time he remembered a lot of student-faculty marriages, but this was the first faculty one he knew of. So after we left Bethany, we went to, knew we wanted to go to South America. So we were applying for these Fulbright lectureships. And there was a gap of time where we went to Monroeville, outside of Pittsburgh, which had a big U.S. Steel research lab. And Paul had a friend that worked there and he got in while we were waiting to find out if we were going to get to South America, which we did.
Are there any particular relationships that have shaped your life in important ways to be an advocate for the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, I would say, number one, my dad was very open-minded. I know we would come home from church and he would say, now, what do you think about what was said? And so it made us think. And he talked about when he was a boy, somebody had burned a cross on his neighbor's lawn, and what it felt like seeing that cross burning in the night. And how he, so then we'd have talks about race relations. So I think that helped me in the journey from a place where everybody was the same to understanding that not everybody is the same, and to say that that's okay. So I think a big leap was when I joined NOW in the women's movement. Probably the Vietnam War helped with this too, opening my eyes to different ways of thinking. But then the women's movement was really big in changing that, working for Planned Parenthood, getting involved in political process, and then becoming a board member of Outreach.
Mm-hmm. Stepping back real quick, did your dad ever give a reason for why the person burnt a cross on the neighbor's lawn?
Well, the neighbor was white, but apparently was seen as a sympathizer of something that the Ku Klux Klan disagreed with, whether it was, I don't know that the neighbor was Catholic. Mm-hmm. So maybe it was something the neighbor had said out in public that some Ku Klux Klaner had heard, and they decided to teach the person a lesson.
Can you tell me more about your family now?
Well, I have, my husband passed away 3 years ago of complications from Parkinson's. So, but I have two daughters. One she splits her time between Syracuse, New York, and Philadelphia. She's married. She's a firefighter in Syracuse. Her husband, they met at Brown University when they were both graduate students. Mm-hmm. And he's a physicist, which my husband was overjoyed with her choice. For that reason, but for other reasons, he's a wonderful, my son-in-law's wonderful. Anyway, they went to Syracuse because he got a job teaching physics there. But he's really, really talented, and astrophysics is his specialty. And so he was lured away from Syracuse by UPenn, where he's now the chair of the department and co-director of a special group that does, research. He goes all around the world lecturing and has colleagues around the world where they do, his is all theoretical, and so they can do a lot with technology and don't have to be physically together. But anyway, my daughter's job is not one you can move. So they have a house in Syracuse and a condo in Philly, and they go back and forth. They don't have any children, they have a cat. And my daughter was the third woman on the Syracuse Fire Department. And she has now worked her way up to district chief, and I believe there are just 12 of those. I think it's the highest non-appointed position. You know, chief and deputy chief are appointed by the mayor.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the mayor appoints the chief, deputy chief, the mayor chooses, or the chief chooses. But anyway, she's worked her way up and is the only woman so far in that position.
What made her pursue that position?
Well, that's really an interesting story. She was a history major. Well, she changed her major several times and ended up in history. She has a PhD from history. So she's a firefighter with a PhD in history. But she taught as a teaching assistant and realized that wasn't for her. So when they first left Brown, they went to Cleveland, and she got on as a stringer, I guess you'd say, on the Cleveland newspaper as a reporter, loved it. So when they moved to Syracuse, she went to that paper and got on as a reporter with the fire and police beat. And, reporters, to get people to open up, they started, jolly them up and talk. And I'm sure somebody said, "Oh, you ought to try this job. See just how hard it is." So she took them up on it. She got on a township, a volunteer department as a volunteer firefighter, and she loved it more than being a reporter. And so she applied to be on the Syracuse Fire Department, which is, your paid non-volunteer fire department.
What does your other daughter do?
Oh, she's in Raleigh, North Carolina. Married, has 2 children, so my 2 grandchildren live in Raleigh. She's a technical writer for a software company, and her husband is an engineer for Cisco. They met out in the Bay Area. She graduated from Princeton with an English degree, and some of her friends graduated from there with equally hard to find job degrees. So one of them, parents had a condo out in Utah at a ski resort. So they all went out there to ski. And Amy decided to go down to Salt Lake City and look for a job, and got on as an unpaid intern at a company that did advertising. And she did so well that when a woman went on maternity leave, they offered Amy the job temporarily, but the woman didn't come back, so she got to stay. So she was out in Utah for about 5 years and realized that all her friends had left. They were tired of skiing. Their parents were, giving them flack for not getting a real job. They were all waiting in restaurants and the like. And so she thought, well, it's about time to start look for something else. And in the meantime, at this company, they had her doing some programming, and she designed a golf course. So she heard about CICS here at Ball State, which was at the time, this was I think the year 2000, was one of maybe 2 places in the country. I mean, it was really a pioneering program. And she applied and got in and then when she graduated, she went out to the Bay Area, worked for Nokia, and then some other companies, and that's where she met Jason.
Have any of your daughters or son-in-laws been active in like organizations relating to now or the LGBTQ community in any way?
No, but they are definitely, their leanings are that way, but they haven't been activists, other than to go to some marches. And some, well, I got 4 tickets to President Obama's first inaugural. Paul didn't want to go, he doesn't like crowds. So, of course, I had 4 people. So it was hard to decide who to invite, but Sarah's husband, the one in Philadelphia, at the time was not a U.S. citizen. He's from the U.K., from England. So I thought, well, I'll offer those tickets first to the 3 U.S. citizens in my family. And of course, they all jumped at it. So they're the ones that got to go. That was a pretty exciting event.
Neat, very neat. How would you describe the LGBTQ plus community in Muncie?
It's thriving. When you think that we're going to have a Muncie Pride event, I think it's in September, it's in the fall.
I believe so, yeah.
I mean, that's really coming a long way. Something I failed to mention, this is getting pretty long, I don't know.
That's
The National Women's Music Festival used to be held on Ball State's campus. It was sort of a sister conference to the Michigan Women's Music Festival, but it was done in Indiana. And I went to some of those festivals, and of course there were women coming from all over the country. And I remember at one of the sessions, some women said that they had been harassed. They were on campus, walking down the street, and a carload of guys, said horrible things to them. They didn't stop, but they made them know they weren't welcome. So that would have been maybe the late 80s, early 90s. So even on campus, there was some, and this was in the summer, maybe they weren't actually students that did that. Might have been townspeople, young teenagers or something. But, that did happen here. But now, I think, and I can remember going door to door, and there would be occasionally someone, you have these 3 issues you talk about, and then you ask, well, do you have any issues you think are really important? And I know there have been some doors where I've been asked, what's your view on gay rights? And, I would tell them, I'm supportive. And you could just see a look of relief in their faces. So people know it's tough being different, but maybe it's not as tough as it used to be. I don't think it is.
Do you consider yourself a part of this community? Why or why not?
Well, yes, I consider myself an ally, I guess you'd say, in that part of the community. I have, friends that are gay and lesbian, good friends. And when I was I think it was in Utah, There were two Ball State students who were a couple who took care of my kids in the evenings that Paul taught classes. They were so supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment that they didn't even charge us. They came over and took care of my kids who were in elementary school, early elementary school. So, and you know, they now live in Indianapolis. They're not a couple anymore, but they were really good friends.
What has it been like for you to be an ally in Muncie?
Well, it means being supportive, being understanding, speaking up. I think, you know, one of the things that's happened that's been really beneficial is that community coming out of the closet, feeling safe enough to do that, because I think that made it safe for other people to, you know, be open about who they are. So I think what I can do is help encourage that by also being welcoming.
Are you?
And really fighting. I mean, as a state legislator, I have a special position where I can speak out for things that I think are important, and that's one of them. So whether it's a bill or if it's just speaking out, I think it makes a difference.
How have you? Can you give us an example of like how you've supported the LGBT community with your position as representative?
Well, I think having a state representative on the board of outreach is useful because I have, you know, connections, and if I put something on my Facebook page that or share something, I think that helps. My votes, I think, help. I guess those are major ways.
Are you aware of any resources that exist in Muncie that may not exist anymore?
For gays?
Yes, for the LGBTQ community.
Well, Planned Parenthood isn't here anymore. And that, I think that's a place where gays and lesbians felt safe to come for healthcare services. So it's gone. And, you know, I mean, it was sliding scale fee. So regardless of your income, you could get services. We do have open door community services. I don't know whether gays and lesbians go there or not, but they do offer those services. There was a time, and I don't know if it's still happening, that the health department offered HIV tests. As I say, I'm not sure if they're still doing that or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
I know that Outreach has had a booth at the county fair several years, and they've had some, you know, pushback. People that didn't want to see them there. Partly was because they would hand out condoms. So it might have been that just as much as that it was a LGBTQ organization.
Is this in recent years?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think they went the last year. In fact, there was a controversy, and they were made to feel unwelcome. And I know this was when I was just first on the board, and we talked about it, and it was the fair board wanted to really restrict what they could do because of complaints. So I know that Laura met with members of the fair board, and Brett Ellison at the time was the chair of outreach, and so probably the two of them went. So, well, then has anybody told you about the infamous incident at Ball Hospital's emergency room?
No.
No? This was a transgender person who went to the emergency room and was treated terribly, insulted when the staff there realized that it was a transgender person. And fortunately, the person complained. The person was humiliated with the way they were treated. And it got out in the newspaper. It went up to the headquarters of IU Health, and they made a statement, and I think it was done, well, maybe the parent plus Ball Hospital made a statement that this was unacceptable behavior and that they were taking, and had 5 or 6 different steps to make sure it didn't happen again, including sensitivity training for the staff. And that was only maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Do you know the name of the transgender person?
No, I don't know that the name ever came out.
Okay.
Laura would probably know.
Laura would probably know. Okay. Thank you. What do you wish Muncie had that it doesn't?
Well, I would like to see outreach grow to be like IYG, or is that it? The youth support group in Indianapolis. I mean, it is huge, and it has so many activities and things for young people. I would like to see that happen. I want to see Muncie Pride grow. I would like to see more of Muncie's churches become welcoming congregations. I think that would make a big difference. And I hope that gender identity discrimination is lessening when it comes to employment, housing in Muncie. There's probably still some of that. Which would be a good area to research, I think, especially housing. So I guess those are major things.
How does Muncie community compare to Indianapolis?
As far as accepting?
Yeah.
Or
just in however you want to take that.
Well, I would guess Indianapolis is more, just because it's bigger, a more diverse population. Having a university here, I think, helps Muncie move forward in our attitudes. But LGBTQ people live in every community. They're in practically every family. And as people realize that, I think that's going to help. My niece and her longtime partner just got married a year ago. I just saw their Facebook page a year ago today. They had the most joyous marriage. They live in Indianapolis, and the marriage was Indianapolis, but the family converged for the wedding, and it was one of the most fun, joyous weddings I've been to.
What is the relationship between the university and the rest of Muncie in terms of the LGBTQ plus community?
I know Spectrum is very supportive of outreach. They've, I think, done fundraising and probably had speakers and volunteers come from the university. I think we've had faculty that's, well, I know we have faculty that's involved. There's one, is it one, I guess? One right now who's a Ball State, he's a board member as a faculty member. There's also a board member who's associated with the hospital. We had one who was he wasn't an intern, he was the next level as he's becoming a regular doctor. He was at Ball Hospital. He's now in Indianapolis and he's got his medical license. He's a full-fledged doctor, but he got his start at Ball Hospital and was very active on the board of outreach. And he's gay.
Is there anything else you would like to add, Sue?
Well, I think I will probably think of something else when I get in the car, but for right now, I think that's it.
All right. Thank you
You're
for
welcome.
coming in.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. I'm glad you're doing this project.
Thank you.